This week we'll be studying Chapter 28, which centers on ecosystems as we continue our studies in ecology to finish up the semester. In the beginning of the chapter we get our regular story, which centers on a title called Too Much of a Good Thing. All organisms require certain elements to build everything in their bodies, from their bones to the chemicals that run their metabolic processes, and phosphorus is an element that is included in one of these essential nutrients that's needed. It's part of our ATP, which is our energy molecules that run our body. It's part of the phospholipid bilayers that surround our cells as the membranes. It's in our nucleic acids, including DNA and RNA and many other biological compounds. Plants meet their phosphorus requirements by taking up dissolved phosphates found in soil water. Animals get the phosphorus by eating plants or eating other animals that have the phosphorus within them, and thus phosphorus taken up from the environment passes from one organism to the next. When a plant or animal dies and decays, then its phosphorus and nutrients get broken down by decomposers and return back to the cycle again. All organisms in a community, together with their environment, constitute an ecosystem, which is the study of our chapter. It's the study of nutrient cycles in ecosystems. That's one aspect of our studies in ecology. Ecology is not the same as environmentalism. Environmentalism is the advocacy for protection of the environment. However, environmentalists often point to the results of ecological studies when drawing attention to a particular environmental concern, and having too much phosphorus circulating around in ecosystems is one of those concerns, and it's actually been made worse by humans. We've taken phosphorus and we've added it to the system in a greater amount than what should be added, and then we get all these extra nutrients, which might sound like a good thing, but it's actually not. Normally phosphorus would be a limiting factor, but when there's a lot of it, then anything can grow, including algae and cyanobacteria that might grow in our waterways and lakes and ponds, and it can overcrowd out other organisms. Those are called algal blooms. It clouds the water and threatens aquatic species. We began using phosphate-rich products when we had no idea of what their effects would be. We just thought that it was nice to have cleaner homes and greener lawns and better fields. But today we have to confront the simple truth that the daily actions of millions of individuals can disrupt nutrient cycles that have been operating long before we humans existed. Our species has a unique capacity to shape the environment to our liking, and in doing so we've become major players in the global flows of energy and nutrients, even before we fully comprehend how ecosystems work. Decisions we make today about environmental issues are likely to shape the quality of life and the environment far into the future. When you get too many nutrients like phosphorus into an ecosystem, that's called eutrophication. Again, that can cause algal blooms, which can threaten other species that are living in the area. An ecosystem comprises both living and non-living factors. The living factors are called biotic factors, like the plants and animals, and the abiotic factors are things like soil, rocks, temperature, climate, moisture, sunlight, etc. I'll also have a reminder that the habitat is like where you live. It's like your address. And your niche, also sometimes pronounced niche, is the role you play in the habitat or your job. So for instance, a lion would live on the African savanna. That would be its habitat. And its niche or niche would be a predator. In ecosystems, organisms and their environment interact through a one-way flow of energy and the cycling of nutrients. Ecosystems require a constant input of energy. Luckily, we have the sun for that. And then nutrients taken up by producers are returned to the environment by decomposers and then taken up again. Light energy that enters the system returns to the environment as heat, and nutrients are continually recycled. So we have a saying in ecology that energy flows through an ecosystem and nutrients cycle. So it could be actually viable to say that a carbon atom that was once in a dinosaur is now in you. An ecosystem runs on energy captured by primary producers or autotrophs. Those would be organisms such as plants and algae, which are a type of protist, and cyanobacteria, who are able to capture sunlight and complete the action of photosynthesis, thereby making sugars that would feed the rest of the organisms known as the consumers in an ecosystem. Primary production or primary productivity is the rate at which producers or autotrophs capture and store energy in the form of carbon compounds like sugar or glucose. This would vary by ecosystem, by season, and by nutrient availability. For instance, here's a chart to let us know about some of the biomes and how efficient they are in regards to primary productivity. Gross primary productivity would be the total amount of carbon products created by producers in a given area in a given time. But then producers, remember, have to do cell respiration as well and need energy to grow and do all their biological functions. So they're going to use some of that sugar that they make. So what's left for the rest of the ecosystem is called net primary productivity, or NPP. This is a chart for net primary productivity. This is read in grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And under terrestrial systems, it looks like tropical rainforests and evergreen forests. Those are very productive biomes, meaning there's a lot of producers and they're cranking out a lot of carbon in a given amount of time. And then that would mean that would leave a lot available for the rest of the consumers to be able to eat, either directly or indirectly. Other terrestrial biomes here, tundras, deserts, those are very unproductive if you look at the comparison of the numbers. Obviously, with the limiting factors of temperature and moisture, it's not going to be able to support a lot of producers. Therefore, there won't be a lot of primary production going on. Not a lot of carbon compounds in the form of sugar available to other consumers. Not a very productive environment. Under aquatic systems, swamps, algal beds, coral reefs, and estuaries are very productive. Whereas open oceans, turning in here as the least productive. And obviously, this would vary geographically. I mentioned consumers before. Consumers are organisms that cannot do photosynthesis. Sometimes they're called heterotrophs as well. They rely on the producers to get what they need. Some consumers directly eat the producers or the plants, and we call them herbivores. Some producers dine on the herbivores or other carnivores. Those are, again, called carnivores. They eat animal flesh. Parasites live in or on a host, thereby usually causing harm, as we learned in last chapter. Omnivores can eat both plants and animals. Detritivores eat detritus, and decomposers eat the wastes and remains. Energy flow and nutrient cycling. Heat energy, unfortunately, is not recycled. Energy captured by producers is converted to bond energy in organic molecules and then released by metabolic reactions that give off heat. Basically going from chemical potential energy to mechanical or kinetic energy. Nutrients are recycled. The producers take up inorganic molecules, the nutrients from the environment like the soil, and then they form organic molecules. Organic molecules, remember, are those that contain carbon. So they make sugar, which then other organisms can eat. Decomposers break down organic molecules and return those nutrients to the environment to keep them cycling. And here's a diagram to show that. Also highlighting that in each step there is a loss of energy as heat. And good thing we have our ultimate source of energy here, the sun. Food chains describe how energy and materials are transferred from one organism to the next. A food chain is basically a description of who eats who, a chain of feeders. And the transfer of energy to higher trophic levels. So going from plants to the herbivores to the carnivores and then back to the decomposers again. A trophic level is the position of an organism in a food chain. The first trophic level is the primary producers, or the autotrophs, who can do photosynthesis. The second level, usually the herbivores, are the primary consumers, such as grasshoppers eating grass. Our third trophic level are the second level consumers, or secondary consumers. They are like a bird eating a grasshopper. They're feeding on the herbivores. Our fourth trophic level is something like a coyote eating a bird. Also called third level consumers or tertiary consumers. Like here again, at the bottom we have our producers, our first trophic level. Second level, our primary consumer. Level 3, we have our secondary consumer. And level 4, we have our tertiary consumer, which is our top carnivore. Remember, they all ultimately got their energy from the sun, which was made available to the rest of the consumers by the producers through the act of photosynthesis. And remember that in the end, all of them will be broken down again by decomposers, who will make those nutrients available to be recycled again. Most food chains usually go up only 4 or 5 levels, and we'll see why that is in a minute. The length of food chains is restricted by the inefficiency of energy transfers. Only about 5 to 30% of energy in an organism at one trophic level ends up in the tissues of an organism as at the next trophic level. So let's look at that. We have a bug eating a producer here, and as it's eating, it gets energy from that producer. Some of it, though, very inefficiently, will end up in its wastes, in its feces, about 50% here. 33% it's going to use. It's going to use and burn it up for cell respiration to make ATP molecules. So 17% of this organism, of what it eats, will go into its growth, into its tissues, and only this will move up to the next level on the food chain. 17% is actually pretty good. Usually it's only about 10% on average. Food chains of an ecosystem cross-connect as a food web. Usually things are not just a nice simple chain. Actually, a food web is more realistic in how organisms feed within an ecosystem. Here's what one food web might look like in an aquatic system. In a food web, the arrow usually points to whoever is getting the energy. There's different types of food chains, like a grazing food chain, herbivores, or a detrital food chain with energy transferred directly from producers to detritivores, like worms and insects. Understanding links in food webs helps ecologists to predict how ecosystems respond to change. And computer models show that all species in an ecosystem are closely linked by trophic interaction. Even in large communities with many species, 95% of species are within 3 links of one another. How interesting. Ecological pyramids are diagrams that illustrate the inefficiency of transfers between trophic levels. Like, for instance, this one. This is a good example of an ecological pyramid here. Notice how the bottom of the pyramid is really big. There's a lot of producers. An ecosystem can support a lot of them because they're getting their energy directly from the sun. Our next level up, the primary consumers, there has to be less of them because they're feeding on the producers. And remember, only about 10% of the energy gets transferred to the next level. And then we have to have less secondary consumers because they're feeding on the level below them. Again, only about 10% of that energy gets transferred to the next level, and so on and so forth till we get to the tertiary consumers on top, where we're left with just a small amount. And here's why. Any given ecosystem can have only so many top-level tertiary consumers. Some pyramids will actually go up to one more level yet, and we would call those quaternary consumers. But usually, if you have your top-level predators up there, an ecosystem only supports a few of those because the transfer of energy from one trophic level to the next is so inefficient. A biomass pyramid shows amounts of organic material in bodies of organisms at each trophic level at a specific time. Here's another food chain pyramid. If we use joules of energy, that's what the J stands for, we would have this many joules of sunlight and this many joules of energy for the primary producers, to the primary consumers down to 1,000 joules, secondary consumers down to 100 joules, and only 10 joules left for the tertiary consumers. So then over here, this is the number of organisms that can be supported. Down to 1 tertiary consumer. at the top level. Feeding a population of meat eaters would require a far greater crop production than sustaining a population of vegetarians. A person who eats a plant food gets most of its calories from that food, but when plant food is used to grow livestock, only a small percentage of the plant's calories end up in the meat. So something to consider is that if humans were vegetarians, all 7 billion of us, the earth would actually be able to support more of us than if we are meat eaters. A one-way flow of energy and the cycling of raw materials among species maintains an ecosystem. Nutrients and energy are transferred in a stepwise fashion through food chains that interconnect as complex food webs. Next section is on biogeochemical cycles. Again, remember nutrient cycle. And this is about different nutrients moving, cycling, and recycling within an ecosystem. And we're going to go over some different biogeochemical cycles. In a biogeochemical cycle, a nutrient moves relatively slowly among its environmental reservoirs. This can include air, water, and rocks, and nutrients can move more quickly into, through, and out of food webs. So the water cycle is our first biogeochemical cycle. 97% of Earth's water is in its oceans. Sunlight energy drives the water cycle by causing evaporation. Water vapor in the atmosphere condenses into clouds and returns to Earth's surface as precipitation. The water cycle is the movement of water among Earth's oceans, atmosphere, and the freshwater reservoirs on land. And here's a picture depicting that. Our abiotic reservoir of water is water that's on the surface of the earth and is in the atmosphere as water vapor. It enters our food chains through precipitation and plant uptake, and we recycle it through transpiration and return it to the abiotic reservoir through evaporation and runoff. Here's transpiration. Sometimes we forget about the importance of transpiration. This is when water moves through a plant like a tree. It moves up through the little tubes within the plant, within the vascular tissue, and then is released into the atmosphere. But cutting down of great forests, called deforestation, is breaking the water cycle. We're kind of stopping that aspect of the cycle or affecting it negatively. When you cut down a forest and we lose transpiration, it can become a desert, and that's called desertification. Here's some of our environmental water reservoirs. Oceans at the greatest, of course. Precipitation that falls on any specific area of land drains into its particular watershed. A watershed can be as small as a valley that feeds a stream or as large as the Mississippi River basin that drains 41% of the continental United States. The watershed is a land area that drains into a particular stream or river. Most precipitation seeps into the ground, then called groundwater. Clay-rich soils hold the most soil water. Sandy soils hold the least. Water that drains through soil layers often collects in natural underground reservoirs called aquifers, which is what we tap into when we make wells. flow of groundwater and surface water runoff slowly returns water to the oceans. Important nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus have soluble forms that can be moved from place to place by flowing water. Runoff, unfortunately, from heavily fertilized lawns, which would contain a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, would then end up in streams and lakes and cause what we talked about at the start of the lecture, eutrophication. That's an excess of nutrients that can cause algal blooms. Groundwater is a limited resource in the U.S. It supplies drinking water to about half of the U.S. Water being drawn from aquifers faster than natural processes that can replenish it. In coastal aquifers, salt water moves in and then replaces the fresh water. That's called saltwater intrusion. In the U.S., about 80% of the water withdrawn for human use ends up irrigating agricultural fields. Again, for the water cycle, most of the Earth's water is in its oceans. Only a tiny fraction is fresh. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation, flow of rivers and streams moves water. Don't forget transpiration. Water plays a role in other nutrient cycles because it carries soluble forms of those nutrients with it. The carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is an atmospheric cycle. Most carbon is stored in rocks and it enters food webs as gaseous carbon dioxide or bicarbonate dissolved in water. The carbon cycle is the movement of carbon mainly between the oceans, atmosphere, and living organisms. The atmospheric cycle, biogeochemical cycle in which the gaseous form of an element plays a significant role. So here's again a diagram to show this. I'll move that over in a minute. The abiotic reservoir of carbon is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well as carbon stored in rocks. It enters the food chain through photosynthesis and returns to the abiotic reservoir as cell respiration when we breathe it back out again, and during combustion, which we have over here. Carbon in rocks is largely unavailable to living organisms. Carbon enters land food webs when plants use carbon dioxide from the air in photosynthesis. Have to remember the photosynthesis equation. Carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight yields the products of sugar in the form of glucose and oxygen. So basically, plants pull carbon in the form of carbon dioxide out of the air for photosynthesis. Then, if you reverse that equation, you have the equation for cell respiration, meaning that we breathe out carbon dioxide as our waste and put it back to the atmosphere. Carbon diffuses between atmosphere and ocean, and bicarbonate forms when CO2 dissolves in seawater. Marine producers take up bicarbonate for photosynthesis, and marine organisms release CO2 from aerobic cell respiration. Many marine organisms incorporate carbon into shells, and shells become part of the sediments, and sediments become limestone and chalk in the Earth's crust. Burning fossil fuels derived from the ancient remains of plants puts additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Atmospheric carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases help keep the Earth warm enough for life through what's called the greenhouse effect. It's the warming of Earth's lower atmosphere and surface as a result of trapped heat by greenhouse gases. 3 steps in the greenhouse effect. Earth's atmosphere reflects some sunlight energy back into space. Some sunlight energy reaches and warms the Earth's surface. Earth's warm surface emits heat energy. Some can escape into space, but some is absorbed and emitted in all directions by greenhouse gases. Global warming, human-induced increase in atmospheric greenhouse gases correlates with global climate change. Current atmospheric CO2, or carbon dioxide, is the highest in 420,000 years and climbing. Global climate change, it's a rise in temperature and shifts in other climate patterns. Reviewing the carbon cycle again. Most of Earth's carbon is tied up in rocks, but organisms take up carbon from water or the air. Carbon dioxide is one of the atmospheric greenhouse gases that helps to keep Earth's surface warm. And increasing carbon dioxide in the air is the most likely cause of climate change. The nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen moves in an atmospheric cycle as well. It's called the nitrogen cycle. There is a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. It's at about 70-some%. And it's there, unfortunately, as is, it's unavailable to us. It's like dangling in front of us right there, and there's nothing we can do about it without the help of other organisms to make it useful to us. So again, the abiotic reservoir is the nitrogen in the atmosphere. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is about 70-some%, whereas for comparison, oxygen is about 22%. It enters the food chain thanks to some organisms called nitrogen-fixing bacteria who live in the soil, and by some other aquatic bacteria. It's recycled by decomposing and nitrifying bacteria, and it returns to the abiotic by denitrifying bacteria. Here's a picture of some nitrogen-fixing bacteria down by some plant roots. Those are some of the only certain bacteria that can make nitrogen available to other organisms or return it to the atmosphere. That's called nitrogen fixation. Bacteria use the nitrogen gas to form what's called ammonia. Some plants can use this, but then they can convert it also to ammonium and then to nitrates. And plants can take up the nitrates. Denitrification is when bacteria convert nitrates or nitrites back to nitrogen gas. So 6 steps in the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria in soil, water, or lichens break the bonds in the nitrogen, which comes in the form of N2, and then they form ammonia, which is ionized in water as ammonium and then taken up by plants. As it's taken up by plants, then it can be useful to the rest of the ecosystem, to the other consumers who eat the plants. So that's how we get it, quite indirectly. First you have to have the nitrogen fixing bacteria, and then the plants take it, and then we get it. Another group of nitrogen fixing bacteria forms nodules on the roots of peas and other legumes. Consumers get nitrogen by eating plants or one another, and decomposers can break it down and send it back to the soil. Nitrification converts ammonium to nitrates. Ammonia oxidizing bacteria and archaeans convert ammonium to nitrite, and bacteria convert nitrites to nitrates. Nitrates are taken up and used by producers, and then we can get it. And then denitrifying bacteria use nitrate for energy and release nitrogen gas back to the atmosphere. Also, it is worth noting that lightning is also a way to take nitrogen and break the bonds between the two ends, and make it useful to the ecosystem. And it turns out that we've been able to fix nitrogen as well in manufacturing, and we've done it and put it into fertilizers, and then we put those fertilizers on our fields and lawns, and then that nutrient runs off into aquatic habitats. And we remember what that's called? It's called eutrophication again. Burning fossil fuels releases nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas that also contributes to acid rain. Nitrogen in acid rain has the same effects as fertilizers. Eutrophication. Alright, the phosphorus cycle. Most phosphorus is tied up in rocks, basically, and in sediments, and it's tied up as a phosphate, a PO4. It moves in a sedimentary cycle. So again, here's our diagram. Our abiotic reservoir is the rocks, the sediments, mineral soil. Erosion with water releases the soluble phosphates, and then it's taken up by plants. And as we already know, once the plants take it up, then it's available to the rest of the consumers in an ecosystem. It'll be recycled by decomposing bacteria and fungi and lost to ocean sediment through runoff. That's how phosphorus cycles. Weathering and erosion move phosphates from rocks into soil, lakes, and rivers. Leaching and runoff carry the dissolved phosphates to the ocean. Phosphorus comes out of solution and settles as deposits along continental margins. Slow movements of Earth's crust uplift deposits onto land, where weathering releases phosphates from rocks. Land plants can then take up the dissolved phosphate from soil water. Land animals get the phosphates by eating the plants or one another. Phosphorus returns to the soil and wastes and remains. In the seas, producers take up phosphate dissolved in seawater, and wastes and remains replenish phosphates in seawater. Phosphorus is often a limiting factor for plant growth. Phosphate-rich droppings from seabird or bat colonies are used as fertilizer. Phosphate-rich rock is also mined for this purpose. Water pollution from high phosphate fertilizers, detergents, or sewage can cause eutrophication. Too many nutrients being washed to our aquatic environments. Here's a review of our nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. They kind of go hand in hand because of the eutrophication effects of them. Plants take up dissolved forms of nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil water. Nitrogen is abundant in the air, but only certain bacteria can make use of the gaseous form. And phosphorus has no major gaseous forms, but most of it's in the rocks. And I'll also add to that once the plants get these nutrients, again, then it's available to the rest of the ecosystem. Too much of a good thing revisited. Water treatment systems can remove phosphates from household wastewater with additional treatment and cost, unfortunately. Phosphate-rich runoff from lawns usually goes into waterways without going through a treatment plant. And the most effective and economical way to keep aquatic ecosystems healthy is to avoid using phosphate-rich products when substitutes are available. Check the bottles, and usually they will tell you if they contain phosphates or not. such as when you buy like dishwasher detergents. And that concludes our chapter on ecosystems.